All right, so yeah, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about this book that I've written, which is called Ontological Design. And it's basically, in my view, a story about unprecedented technological possibilities. Now, before we start, just want to say, like, for all of you who are here, if you have any questions that come up, drop them in the chat. I want to have this session be as sort of interactive as possible, as live action as possible. So if anything comes up, you need clarification about something, let's have it happen that way. Yeah, what is ontological design? I define it as this discipline that is about designing humans, right? Right now, we could say that there's a war happening for our attention. Many of us may be aware of this from just simply existing in the world where there's so much media, so much saturation about media, and all of this content that is created has almost been created in a weaponized way, in a way to propagandize and to skew our brains. It's almost like a silent takeover. Many people might think that it's the province of crazy conspiracy theories, that we are being brainwashed at scale, right? MK Ultra was not something that was designed in a lab. It was made for everybody at all times. But I would say, and I would dare say, that actually this idea that we can be brainwashed not only at scale but by design using modern technologies is basically the vanguard of the technology and design industries. And I feel like this is set to explode into the mainstream in the next 10 to 20 years. This ability to utilize technology and to frame environments, to engineer contexts, is basically of our times, as we have been plugged into the router. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, because in many ways, we all know that we live in a post-truth era. We all know that we live in an era of media saturation. But I'm going to talk to you about discovering a new weapon, a new skill, a new way of thinking that hopefully updates many old disciplines so as to basically give us sort of a weapon of self-defense, but also a weapon that implies incredibly vile offense. And this is basically not a matter of a possibility. Maybe we could explore this discipline. I think it's a matter of necessity. We kind of have to, otherwise we're pretty much screwed. So this war that's happening, right? It's happening not only about the things we believe, what we constitute as true, right? The ideas that we include in our mindsets, in our meme plexes, but also it's about our inherent constitution because of feedback loops. It's something that's affecting how we constitute ourselves as subjects, because as we know, this information that we consume every day is not something that can just, it's not a matter of believing A or B. No, it becomes constitutional because we process ourselves. We desire, when we can't sleep at night, the things that exist in our mind that will program the next few days. These are things that are constitutional. So the way out of this that I wanted to talk to you about, which is ontological design and seeing the subject as a project, it's a tactical way out of this. Is a design and architectural tactical way out of this. One of the things that it overlaps with, and that people are usually very interested in, it is that it overlaps with occultism, with ritually designing attention, not dissimilar to what the Crowleys of the past used to do. In other words, if the Crowleys of the past used to deploy all sorts of resources to create these perceptual interfaces around people, to put people into curated and engineered environments where they would be basically swayed to believe story A, B, and C. Well, I argue that today we can do that by design, and we can do that with the modern technologies of the digital and the internet era, including AI, but also with design thinking. There's a methodology of design thinking that allows us to alter perception via design. Wasn't Aleister Crowley was the first UI designer, or one of the first user interface designers, basically because he understood that when you confront someone with a media platform, with an interface, you're basically telling that person, think through here. And this is not only common to informational interfaces, right? It's not only a matter of the war of propaganda and making sure that your message is louder than the message of the other guy, or that it has better, it's more skilled or something like that. You could expand this onto design as a broad discipline. And this is the core, the theoretical core of ontological design. Namely, that all design has practice effects. If I'm used to writing with a pencil, that I'm going to become used to writing with that pencil with my right hand in this specific manner, or drawing with it. These practice effects will affect me in turn. That leads to the core idea, the theoretical core of ontological design, which is the feedback loop. What is the feedback loop? So once upon a time, basically since around the late 90s, authors like Tony Fry, Terry Winograd, and Fernando Flores have been exploring theoretically this idea of ontological design in their work and design philosophy. But the main proponent of this idea is an Australian design professor called Anne-Marie Willis. And she proposed this term as an interpretation of Heidegger's philosophy applied to design. Her conceptual innovation was radical compared to traditional ways of thinking about design. We all know that what we design has an impact on people, and our environments affect us. Colors, everybody's got this pop psychology understanding of this. The thing is, this goes really deep, and it's radical in an age of AI. So let's take it from the start. Anne-Marie Willis argues that the subject is designed and influenced by their environment in a feedbacking fashion. There's a co-creative feedback loop between the subject and their context. These glasses are in this sense of this relationship not really distinguishable from me, from my act of seeing, from the act of projecting myself onto the world, and in the act of being in this relationship. We humans design our worlds. We build buildings and we create objects, we create interfaces and designs. And if you take a look around you, most artifacts around you have actually been designed, and you learn to use them. Your chair, your mug, your clothes, your spoons, all the way to the shoes and the smartphones, somebody designed them. So, but what we often overlook is the reverse. Therefore, so the fact that our creations also create us, that they also design us, they determine how we react and how we interact with them. If you think about your chair right now, the chairs discriminate between the different modes of sitting that they allow. By simply existing, the chair tells you, sit in this way, do not sit in that way. It is a discriminatory political statement onto how you sit. Now, you may think, well, that's not really that political, Daniel. Well, it is a little bit, and design is always political in this sense. And that's kind of a deeper implication of ontological design, because if you can tell people via your devices and your artifacts that you put into the world, sit this way, think that way, and if that is political, then everything is political. And that's where we get to the crux of ontological design and its implications on geopolitics. But we'll get there. The idea is that, even if you go back to your clothes, they amplify your body's ability to keep a stable body temperature, right? Functionally speaking, the clothes are prosthetics for your skin. They help you keep warm a little bit more. Whenever pieces of clothing or chairs are created and used, therefore, ontological design is at play. And a political form of design is at play that designs your subjectivity as your subjectivity learns to exist in relation to these apparatuses. So, ontological design, the way that I formulate it, is only really possible today. Previously in the past, you might have had these insights being spread throughout different disciplines. Maybe in advertising and design, some people might have had this insight. Maybe religion had some of these insights. Script writing and storytelling had some of these insights. But only today can we find this unique constellation of intersecting disciplines. Never before was it possible to have so many different domains talk to each other in such a meaningful way. If you think about it, or what I want to tell you, is that ontological design is the love child of design, naturally, but also the love child of postmodern philosophy and warfare. In this unholy orgy, we also find advertising and PR, propaganda and warfare, artificial intelligence, occultism, and architecture. What happens when all of these get put into a room and, when they have a baby? Well, ontological design comes out. Let me define it a little bit more succinctly so that we can have this definition moving forward. Ontological design, I would say, is the art and science of causing change to a being and its consciousness as part of a creative project. So it is about designing the interfaces that allow that being or our being as a verb to take place. Interfaces from the chair. Interfaces can be anything, right? It can be a chair, it can be a computer, it can be a screen. And the thing is, by creating these interfaces, you are literally talking to that feedback loop. You're intervening in the co-creative relationship between the human and its environment, a continuous relationship. A person who designs, this is a very unidimensional way of giving an example, but I will repeat it. The person who designed these glasses and the fact that they complement my eyesight, this is no small feat. There's a continuity happening here. My sight, my seeing, my cognition, my being is ontologically continued, extended by existing in relationship to these glasses. Now, you may think glasses will not change the world. They're just mundane, parochial examples. And I will say, of course. But the thing is, the matter doesn't stop at glasses. It goes all the way up to the geopolitical. And that's where we'll be going to talk. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. The thing is, our human bodies have no limits. Our post-human bodies don't have a limit. They are continuous with the design artifacts around us, like our glasses, but also with one thing that is very special. They're continuous with the memes of our perception. The ideas and the symbols that we use in our minds function to our minds in the same way that my glasses work to my eyes. They continue, they enable, they have this, they facilitate a specific way of perceiving. And so this is no small matter, because what happens when you take a load of memes and you stack them together, you start to get into the realm of the social and the political. You start to ask yourself, well, can we actually design morality? Can we start to design discourses? The subject of the ontological design project can be an individual, if you so desire, and I'll get to the means on how to do that in a little bit. But it could also be a collective. Could you hypothetically then redesign what good means to a specific population if you control the variables? I argue yes. Could you do this deliberately? I argue yes. You could commodify morality. You could sell the ability to design morality to the highest bidder. That's what's happening right now in the arms race towards collective brainwashing. So all that I'm saying here is that interfaces of all sorts collaborate to constitute a subject. They collaborate to constitute the human subject. And this is, I don't say this gleefully, but I say this pragmatically. This is an update to a variety of old disciplines, from propaganda to religion to storytelling to design. Basically, what we're doing is creating the world, the life world in which subjects exist. So the horrible realization that we can come to at this point is that ontological design can be this tool for incredible oppression. You can put people into reality tunnels, which is a concept that comes from Robert Anton Wilson, a concept which means basically everything that you are surrounded by, everything that you see in your life, that is your reality tunnel. All the sense perception that comes in front of you, everything that you think is the world as it appears to you, well, that's could be designed. And this makes us think that there's a danger. There's a danger because this is something new and powerful. Design can be a weapon in the middle of the networked world because it can intervene very precisely onto the memes and memeplexes of our world. The thing is, before we jump into the actual, let's say, geopolitical implications of this, we need to sort of lose a little bit of innocence. When you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. When you invent the plane, you also invent the plane crash. And when you invent electricity, you also invent electrocution. Every technology carries its own negativity, which is invented precisely at the same time as technical progress. So that's what I say ontological design also represents. It represents the invention of design as a weapon that interferes precisely in the middle of the war of minds and of the war over subjectivity. And that danger, however, is precisely what we should be looking into. That is the ethical thing to do. The ethical constraints of ontological design are central, right? How can we talk about, is this moral? What is moral design when design can design morality? That's a tricky one, isn't it? Well, the only answer to that is to keep going, because to look into this danger is the ethical thing to do. I feel like there's a great risk today. And I'm going to go straight into it. So there's this idea, right, called noumahia, which is this term used by this Russian geopolitical theorist and philosopher called Alexander Dugin. He's an overall human being because his theories have influenced the Russian expansionist efforts that are leading to the war in Ukraine, etc. But this concept is not out of place. Noumahia etymologically derives from the Greek term nous, meaning mind, and mache, meaning battle. So it refers to mind battles waged in the mind, for the mind, and through the mind. It means that design is basically in a state of war, even though this war is not necessarily visible, and obviously that's a tactical consideration. Our perceptions right now, today, are bound in this mind war. All the media that you consume, every constitutional brick of your reality tunnel is conscripted into this war. The great magic trick of the military class is conscripting us all into a military conflict of which we have no idea. So, although I completely disagree with Duginism, I think I could go there. I want to be pragmatic and actually rescue this term from him, because yes, there is a war happening in the noosphere, in the sphere of minds, in dimensions that can be referred to as memetic. And yes, technology is at the crux of this war, in the same way that technology is what enables ontological design to be thought, to be even an idea that we speak about. And listen, we live, the network paradigm in which we live today impacts us all at an ontological level. We evolved for berry picking and being nomadic, not for Fortnite and TikTok and whatever it is that we consume. So our minds, yes, are plugged into something that they have never been used to being plugged into, to content that is, at a speed and at a level that we cannot deal with this. So this, you could almost say, again, returning to the beginning, that there's an arms race, that people are scouring this new technological landscape for new means and new ways to achieve advantage over other people in the war of mind, to brainwash better than the next guy, to put it in very simple, crude terms. Persuasion and propaganda, for example, through the last decades have been culminating, like I said, together with AI and other ideas, and culminating into this new craft or new will to impact human perception and subjectivity at a very great scale, in a way that was never possible before. And so you could almost say that there's a scramble happening today for the noosphere. A scramble that affects the spheres of the market, of capitalist innovation, right? All the innovation companies are basically designing experiences, and they will soon get to the realization that, oh, to design experiences, you can actually trap people into reality tunnels and monetize the hell out of that. But then geopolitics is also doing the same thing, not only through narrative influence and propaganda campaigns, as was the typical case in the last century, but at a much deeper level, to the point that it almost gets theological or spiritual, at least in verbiage, like the terminology of speaking of, to say that the crux of this war is theological is a heuristics, is a useful way to call names to these things, because basically this war is constituted by ghosts, or rather these ideas that we bring into the table, that the means through which we design perception, the means through which you perceive, through which you process yourself as a verb in relation to the world, it is not surprising that we may speak of them and through them as gods or spiritual entities. And even if we don't at the surface, if you look at pop culture today, what is a celebrity? What is a star? What is a Ronaldo, if not an Apollo? What is Beyonce, if not an Aphrodite? All that I'm saying is that we very quickly, this is the limit of ontological design, where it stops being a mercenary theory and it starts to be a very dangerous creative craft. Because very quickly you can realize that, okay, we are designing reality tunnels that are in competition. We're designing the cults that are currently engaged in a certain warfare. But how to engage in this? Well, if you're going to engage in that, you also have some certain skin in the game. You are also sort of putting yourself out there. Because if you're going to design realities, then you also assume that your reality might also be designed. And then you come face to face with the outpouring of incredible unconscious content from your side. And that's the risk that true ontological creativity demands. If you're going to go the full way, you don't have to go the full way. You can sell, and I'm certainly preparing myself to sell this as a mercenary for the industry, selling muck reality tunnels. And this is something that not only people will want, but it's a clear business case to make. But there's something additional which requires incredible risk: the risk of suffering the absurdity of the cosmos. Because when you're designing morality, and you must assume that your morality might also be designed, that it is not true in and of itself, but might have been designed and might not be true. And then what are you left with? With nihilism? Perhaps. Madness? Perhaps. You have to risk it. And my answer to this nihilism is affirmation, is the affirmative nihilism. It is to say yes to the absurdity of the cosmos, yes to the fact that we can fucking envelop ourselves in stories that might be designed, and we might design them with great technique and with great skill. But the fact that we are designing, is the right attitude to have, because, as we said, via the feedback loop, we are continuous with our environments. And so my conclusion here is that the attitude that we should have is a constant creativity, a constant subjective reinvention. In this scramble for reality that is happening, and I reiterate again, that is happening at the geopolitical level and at the capitalist level, we are not helpless. We must risk creating. I suggest we become initiated then into this practice of voluntarily suspending disbelief. Suspending disbelief on the meme plexus that we choose. Choose to believe something as a creative shamanic practice. That is the risk that design can ask. And yes, we can lose ourselves, but what the hell? To be lost is the essence of being alive. To be confused. This is the ethical necessity, because, like I referred to previously, we live in the noosphere, right? The sphere of mind is today becoming incredibly volatile because the information is flowing so fast. And it's a new continent. So what do new continents need? They need pioneers. And the ethical necessity of this sort of pioneering is to go and risk being lost. You don't know what exists in this new environment, but we have to go. Today, wars are fought over perception. And as a countermeasure, true rebels should design their own perception, or mercenaries should sell the ability to design perceptions. Whatever floats your boat. But my suggestion here is not to try and make the world make more sense, because the ways of making sense of the past are long gone. Those boats are crashed. My suggestion is to increase our capacity for handling senselessness. Handling as a verb, as a heuristics. Screw having one idea of how the world is and sticking to it forever. We need to learn to thrive in the absurdity and stupidity of the networked age. And that's ground zero for this new kind of design. We need to be able to enjoy the madness and learn to see the new kinds of beauty. And that isn't too different from what occultists and psychedelic explorers and religious shamans and so many different categories of people have explored throughout history. There's billions and billions of potential realities. We need to be continually discovering them if we're going to be these designers of the new paradigm, creating lines of flight away from our degradation at the hand of other reality designers. And I know that this is a danger. This is not for most people, and that's fine. Maybe it's not even for me. I'm just saying how it could happen. But there is going to be an increasingly nomadic class, and even humanity itself. We will no longer have the luxury of our ancestors to live in one reality that is stable for generations upon generations. We are now sort of tasked with a burden that we cannot forfeit, that of continually creating different reality configurations. Because the era of AI and its impossibly large computation allows subjectivity to become a creative process, a project. The greatest artists of tomorrow are going to create in perception itself, and humanity will be forever changed because of that. That's the prize of this arms race, to design a future for mankind and how living happens. So that's my message. In that capacity of ontological designers, we need to dare explore and lose ourselves in this process, so that our feet and the things that we design are not necessarily just the footnotes in the conclusion of a dying era, but actually embrace the madness of the new era of AI, of the networked age, so that we can write the preface for a brave new era. For that, we will have, and maybe in the Q&A we can bring those up, many resources and many tools. I'm currently writing a handbook for how this can be done and literally pursued by a team of creatives. And maybe we could, if that's of interest, raise that in the Q&A. But basically, there are practical things we can do and use in order to perform ontological design as the art and science of causing change to a being and its consciousness as part of a project.
Fantastic, Daniel.
Thank you.
I really like your book. It's available everywhere right now.
Yep, via Amazon.
Yes. So before we open that up for general discussion and the Q&A, I have a question. And so it's an ethical question to this whole idea. So because you mentioned the question, should we create morals for parts of population or even for whole populations? And I was wondering also, because you mentioned Robert Anton Wilson and Crowley, because especially Crowley and Robert Anton Wilson, they were about magic, and they were also about freedom, the freedom of reality tunnels, the freedom of the attachment to certain memes or apparatus that's what you call it, or memeplexes.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you design those objects, you outsource this capacity and let other people, kind of decide in what kind of reality tunnel you live in, which would be counterintuitive from the point of view of the shamans that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So why should we want to design and morals for the population. Because there will always be libertines that say, no, my goal is to be free of them.
Yeah.
Not to be, because I can't design all my chairs and my Tupperware and my surroundings. And even if I'm actually engaging in magic, that is such a costly, time-consuming thing to do. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Once upon a time, in the depths of the dungeons of the internet called 4chan, I saw this comment, and someone said that it was in the board about conspiracy theories. It was the paranormal board, and in there, some schizo wrote something like, "There is a war between high priests happening right now over reality, and we are oblivious to it." What does this tell me? It tells me that, to answer your question, design and the considerations around ontological design, especially because it has this property of being able to reach perception and design it so powerfully, immediately become political and competitive. Because I can design in self-defense for myself, but I can also design to influence the reality of another. The objects that I have in my house, they are not fully defended from the interventions of capitalism and whatever messages and scripts this imprints on me. And as such, the dimension of design that is political is inescapable. And precisely because of that is why I say that ontological design has this, or rather, my attitude towards it is Machiavellian. It is pragmatist. It is to say, yes, of course, there will be competition and war via design. Has humanity ever not had war? No, war is a human universal. Sadly, competition is a human universal. Sadly, it is simply now expanding towards a new...
I understand that's already happening. No, that's you also mentioned this is something that we have to assume is already happening from political parties and
there are some vanguardists perhaps exploring this here and there.
But it's the problem of our notion of let's say American democracy is that it's somewhat embedded is in there the evangelistic idea that we have to bring it to other people, and that always leads to bad outcomes. Although the idea of democracy is great, and so it's the same problem. Why it only it might happen already, but it doesn't mean we should employ it.
Now, this is yeah, I understand exactly where you're going for, I guess. Frequently people ask, okay, if you can design reality, then what's the reality that we should design? Right? What's, obviously one of freedom. And if you look at geopolitics, for example, one of democracy and liberty and equality. But there's a catch to that, which is we need to be able to to at least conceptualize and do the mental exercise of conceptualizing what it would mean to do the opposite gesture, because then we are being technically realistic and faithful. In other words, I'm not going to prescribe what realities we should design. I'm going to say how we should do them. And in order to understand deeply how we should do this level of design, we need to be able to contemplate its risks, its impossibilities. We need to be able to flirt with dystopia, or to understand what kind of domination could be possible if you give this, if your lead ontological designers and all your technologists go work for the other guy, for the bad guy. This is tricky, but it's essential. It's tricky because it makes us think. And by the way, I'm completely a democratic, pro freedom, etc. But this is tricky because to do this exercise might put you a little bit too close for comfort to the fact that the bad guys could also use this against you. And this is uncomfortable. And that's precisely why there's this risk inherent to ontological design, which is this risk of playing with what you don't know, with creating in connection to death, to negativity, to chaos. But I argue that this is important for ontological design to graduate a little bit above whatever the CIA is currently doing, and to graduate up to whatever the Catholic Church once did. which is to go above the level of the political, the designing of cults within a specific conception of morality and good. In other words, you can design within a discourse, but you can design discourses themselves. And within a discourse, you can design very well, and you can have much success within a specific static conception of good. But if you are going to design new conceptions of good, then you need a madman, and you need a prophet, or you need an artist. And those are the people who are able to hold the cross or hold the pain or embrace the burden of saying, you know what? Maybe this conception of good that people live under and people need, and God knows I also need it, maybe this conception of good, could there be any other one? And how to deal with that. So that's why I claim that there's a special case of ontological design, hypothetically, ontological designers that would have this role, this tantric, creative, spiritual role of inventing new realities out of nothing.
Yeah, but I'm still not convinced, because, like, at least in this regard, because you don't want that kind of psychotechnology or design technology to fall in the hands of the people of Davos. We were joking about this, but
Why?
Huh?
Why?
That's a good question, because at least from my personal experience, I'm trying to get out of those reality tunnels and not be attached to them.
So, in one way, it's like the most Christian.
That's not the right. I would say I would like to play with those reality tunnels, not to escape them completely. So that would be. But it's like,
I mean, that's a political position that you personally choose to pursue. But what we need to understand is that the politics of how we perceive ourselves in the world can also be designed. And even if
who designs it, that's the question.
It's really a matter of a brief and of the designer. It depends on the case. Everywhere we look, design designs us in return. The book invents us as a reader, and the glass invents us as a drinker, and Davos invents us either as its fans or its anti-fans. Like the Satanists are Christian. They're just anti-Christian, but they're still Christian. Sure. So there's this the idea that reality tunnels, these nuological houses, these mind houses, these meme plexes, they exist and we live under them and through them. To say that one is more desirable than another is a political act. And I can easily imagine a scenario, Tom, where you would say, well, Davos is great. Davos is amazing. I want Davos's ideology to spread across the world. And if you can't, then why not try imagine that scenario? Because that will perhaps dissolve a little bit our defensiveness around our reality tunnel and make us flirt with the other one. Now, this is very psychedelic. Then it means that all of a sudden anything is possible. And that's the danger. Psychosis. Like, oh my God, what is reality? Well, anything can be a reality. You can design anything. Yeah, basically.
No, I get the idea, and I completely concur with the idea. But what I'm asking is that why would I outsource that? I mean, I can't. That's the reason why we have IKEA, because we can't just design our chairs. I mean, we can, but
and we can design the constellations of our memes as well. But we also can have a nuological IKEA.
I get that, but it's like the one thing is to design that for yourself and to create your reality tunnels and your memes, and the other one is the kind of approach. Okay, let's outsource it and let's do that for populations.
Honestly, that's the only way that I see this being possible at scale, and that's the direction that I'm actually moving into pragmatically. It's very dark, but literally, like if you're going, I believe that in order to actually make ontological design projects that work, you need to be taking steps. You need to have a proper team assembled. You need to have a special methodology assembled. And this is, in my experience and view, only possible within sort of the consulting industries or literally the design industries. I'm speaking about a design research sprint. In a way, we are all amateur ontological designers. We are all amateur ontological designers, but there's a space where we can get professional, and there's a route where that can happen. Sadly, I think that is inextricably tied to big money, big corporations. But it could also be the case that small groups of people can also create their own tunnels and design their own means of their own perception. This is what we call cults. Usually they go
I mean, Facebook and
sometimes.
Instagram, they're already doing this, as far as I understand what you're saying.
And they're learning to do it better and better and better. And the implications of that are in plain sight to see for the last 20 years.
Daniel, do you want to open it up for the general?
Yep, absolutely.
All right. So, does anybody want to chime in? There's some questions. Oliver.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Yeah, super interesting. It makes me think about, the sort of meta-modern practice of perspective taking that, like, Hansi Freitag talks about. You go beyond just taking the perspectives, but also curating them and executing them.
Yeah.
And I guess like, you can imagine this as humanity, if humanity, starts to create habitats, or, we're starting to do this with, like, Mars fantasy, or however you want to look at it. But this kind of thing is going to be necessary, I think, when we start to do that.
Yeah.
And it could kind of offer us a sort of menu of ontologies to choose from, or for limited periods of time, maybe sample an ontology. And this is what I think, like, we're many more of us are starting to do this in our own heads, but it doesn't manifest in the world. We're still living in suburbia and living with people who are traditional, or
whatever.
So I guess the question is, how would this manifest in the physical world as we perceive it, and and where does the metaverse come into this? I mean, that's like, I'm about to take a job that is like designing for a VR company, and so that's clearly like a domain where these skills and this concept is gonna probably take hold first of all, where you're literally designing environments and perceptions of those environments, and or not purposely, like, influencing people to think a certain way. So how do you see this spilling over into reality, that goes beyond, like, what religions do, what creative authors do? How is this going to spill into reality?
Great question. I loved how the example of habitats on Mars is a super useful example, because it's very clean as an example. And maybe that could be a conceptual stepping stone to be able to start to think about other more complex interfaces. Other more complex dynamics that might happen down the road when ontological design is deliberately employed in the noosphere. So it's going to be very chaotic down there, but to make it clean and easy for us to understand, habitats on Mars. Brilliant. That's brilliant. Because when we go to Mars, we're not only going to take our technologies to create these spheres where we can live in and grow our food. We're going to bring our ideas, our social practices, our ways to govern ourselves, our ideas of good versus evil. This menu of ontologies, therefore, that we bring with us needs to be as carefully considered as the spaceships that we take and as the technologies that we take, because it's basically humans that we're going to be talking about. That is why, the Elon Musks of this world will also require that level of resource, that human resource that is able to, you mentioned artists, you mentioned religions, and I think that's very precise, because at the core of our discourses and of our moralities, there's usually a kernel, of religion, of narrative, of storytelling. Not because there's something in there, but precisely because that's the place where we deal with what isn't there. And at the point where human groups, human individuals, human collectives come face to face with their impossibilities, my God, the cosmos makes no sense. We go religious, we go narrative, we go speculative, right? But not everybody, like I said, is able to do that. It's a very dangerous thing. And that's why some people go mad and some people become prophets, and or artists. And that's just the way that it is. And so at the crux of a tenable memeplex is always the libido of a human subject, who is able to speak from the root of the phallus, i.e. who is able to to stand in nothingness without any reference point. That's why Mars is such a beautiful example, because there's nothing in Mars. So how do these ontologies spill out onto reality, perhaps? Especially in the context of the metaverse. That's very interesting. Like Rami, who is here also in this chat, him and I used to work on his studio called Somewhere Else. It was a virtual reality studio in London in 2018. And that's kind of a place where a lot of these ideas were fleshed out. And one of the things that I concluded was that, yes, we are designing these metaverse spaces where you can design the environments, which in turn will design the people. However, I think it's a very limited domain. But there's an indirect lesson. The lesson of virtual reality is that all reality is virtual. Namely, that all reality, virtual reality shows an impulse. It teaches us something. It shows us how humans want to just design bits and bobs of their environment. What if objects were smart? What if this could react to me in this and that way? What if this mirror is a smart interface? What relationship will I have to it then? What relationship will I have to my pen when it's networked? These are user experience design questions that are deep and become extremely networked together. And what I claim is that as they network together more and more and more densely, then they get to this idea of morality and religion and ontology. So the way that it spills out onto reality is it already does. It always already does. We already live in a virtual reality. All of our reality around us is composed of virtual fictions. That doesn't mean that there's a real behind those fictions. That just means that fictions are all that there is, and their impact is incredibly real. What is money? It's a really real fiction. That's one example. There's many others. So ontological design is this affirmative response to fiction, and it says, yes, everything is fiction. Yes, let us design it. Yes, let us take up this mantle that used to belong to other domains, and today needs to be reformulated if we are going to even survive techno-capitalist expansion towards the world of AI. I hope that answered your question.
Kind of. When are we going to start seeing jobs appear for ontological design on Indeed?
If it depends on me, 5 to 10 years, and then never again. There's a window. 5 to 10 years, there's many jobs, it's a thing, and then never again, because the job will be done. That's what I mean by the political domination aspect of it. Right. This is a war. Whoever wins that war will obscure the reality of everybody. Do you see any ads for Pope jobs? No. It's the same reason.
Yeah.
I'd say.
It's quite worrying.
Good. That's the only answer I can give. Like good, or hopefully good. I'm scared. I say good, but I'm scared.
So there's a question from Rami. I could read it. And he writes, Daniel, great talk. Please don't become a perception mercenary. You mentioned the new sphere, and you mentioned that you were designing reality tunnels that are in competition. So in a way, shifting from content creation to content design. I see this in most tech interventions out there that are failing to achieve sustained behavior change because you're changing one module of human behavior, not the perception of being human. And so the question is, can you talk more about the practical toolkit you're designing?
Brilliant question. And yeah, Rami, I know very much the work that he's involved with. Genius guy. So the toolkit and the handbook that I'm working on is not an answer to this question, Rami, but it is a method to reach that answer. It's a solid discovery phase. It's a solid design research sprint, from end to end, from discovery to testing and prototyping. And that I feel, obviously, the more it's for it to be a proper project, for it to be like a Truman Show, it needs a budget. But it would involve the composition of a team of several people from the design domain, like service designers, business designers, UX designers, technologists, those who study the technological interfaces that make possible these interventions in the life world of a human, strategists to analyze, like, for whoever's banking the bills, what's in it for you, what's the business analysis on this, and then, like, academic SMEs wherever they are relevant, from philosophers, psychologists, artists, anthropologists, etc., and then loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of content creators, from art directors, copywriters, conversation designers, script writers to script your life, musical composers, scent designers, scenographers, novelists. So you can understand there are a few domains within the team, a few tasks that these people will have to do. You can divide them hierarchically. There's a program director, and there's like, it's literally an agency, right? But it's an agency that's kind of geared outside of the digital design environments that we're used to something else. And the exercises that the designers and the team, but led by the designers, are going to actually do to unpack this problem that you've just asked about are going to also be a little bit tweaked. So like when instead of doing a discovery of how does the website work for this company and as is, so that we can compare it with what we're going to do, maybe it's not the website you're analyzing. Maybe it's the structures of subjectivity. Maybe instead of customer shadowing and you like looking at how many people take up the bottom shelf treats from the supermarket between 10 and 11 p.m., shadowing, customer research, run-of-the-mill standard industry practices. Maybe you have loads of psychologists and psychoanalysts looking at the things that people say, how they say it, what are their habits. And all of a sudden you can parametrize, gather data, plug it in. You don't even need to plug it into AI yet. But all that I'm saying is this is enough to create a working, manageable picture of the entity, of the subject that we're trying to design. And we could go into an envisioning stage. And in that envisioning stage, you can take what you've learned on the discovery phase about, when you were shadowing the person, when you were shadowing their psychosexual needs. I know this sounds scary. Believe me, it does. But when you're like shadowing all of this, then you're mapping their subjectivity. And then you can approach, and these are big words, but these are true words. You can approach subjectivity as a creative project. You can do workshops on this stuff. You can do a bunch of exercises from like the typical post-it exploration, like discourse workshops or cultural positioning workshops, personality interfaces. What are the key behavioral chains? It's not just one or two, it's how they all weave together. And that's perhaps why, speaking to that content creation, moving from that to context design, because we're not just making one flow, we're doing all of them. That's why it's a big project and it takes a lot of work and perhaps budget, but that's where it's a stacking thing, right? Moving towards these ideal subjectivity constellations and so on and so forth. And then then we are able to begin to speak of such things as mental urbanism, psychosexual collective plumbing, if you're designing a cult, which is like probably 100x harder than designing for an individual. We're Truman showing civilization itself here. That's incredibly, that's just real. I debate with the horribleness of this every day, believe me, but that's just what we are now facing, and we have to think this through. So yeah, and then you can test and you can prototype and you can have pitch meetings for this stuff. You know, I could go more on detail about this. I don't have that much more detail about this, but it's literally transposing the methods of the most current methods of the industry and translating them a little bit to a different domain.
So we need to get like Denis Villeneuve to direct this solar punk future that, like,
No, you need to get McDonald's to pay for it. And I mean, that is it desirable? No. Is it probably going to happen through a McDonald's, through an Amazon, through an Apple? Probably. Listen, Disney has got these things called Life World. No, Disney Story Living in Catino, California. It's a resort. It's like, you know, a resort where people go and live in, but it's all Disney. The water is always blue, literally painted blue. It's all extremely perfect. It's like the Black Hole Sun video by Soundgarden. It's disturbingly perfect. However, it teaches us this this idea that, yeah, people are starting to look at context engineering, something that comes from Carl Smith, who's also here. And yeah, they're employing this. That this has always been an insight that Disney has always had. And that's why I make this point, Oliver, of bringing it into this field of competition and war, sadly, because that's a more realistic frame to look at it, other than, oh, let's all project towards a solar punk future that is desirable for us all. Desirable and feasible is very different, and it usually falls down to the condition, to the key determining factors of human competition and war, which is probably money, very sadly. But the people who have the most money will probably design the best realities.
Do you not take some hope in like taking a developmental perspective on it, and you know, seeing that perhaps the most developed groups will take control of this?
I guess the saving grace is the great artists and the great prophets and the great, you know, that's the only saving grace. But there's a reason why Christ has the cross and he died on the cross, because, or as in the story, right? Because that's an enormous burden. The idea that there's a developmental structure is a great story. It's safe. There's a structure to the world. There's a cadence to the universe. It's going somewhere. That somewhere is better than today. But maybe the truth is that there isn't any. And that's fucked up.
So Magdalena has a question. Sorry, I interrupted you, Daniel.
Hi. Hi, Daniel. Deveria dizer olá.
Olá.
Posso dizer olá.
Claro que sim. Olá.
And this kind of illustrates a little bit where I'd like to go with this, because I could speak to you in a different language. So I love, and it's after Heidegger, you know, you either face the danger or you have catastrophe. So, you know, I love that emphasis that you put, that we have to face the danger and not indulge in hopeful ignorance. But one of the things that I've come across that you're probably familiar with is Duke Ui's premise of how the universality of this narrative that you just sort of deconstructed, that we're not just progressing towards better and better and better, is a Western construct. And if somehow, and I think this really does come down to, you know, Zechstein and education between two worlds, if we realized that the only way to start to inflect this trajectory where whoever owns the algorithms owns the world, technodiversity, meaning that what has not been able to really be expressed, and I know there are experiments, like there's indigenous people coding directly into AI, which obeys different cosmologies. But even you, as a Portuguese person in Denmark, are constantly experiencing, I'm willing to bet, the fact that you can experience your bica, which is your espresso, in the same way culturally as you would wherever in Portugal you're from or when you come. So the richness of this technodiversity, and I have no idea, other than my examples are ancient in a way, because I was a residential architect for about 30 years. And of course, when you're dealing with each client, you enter a cosmology, that's very particular. You start interviewing people and, you don't even know why they like this particular plant until you find out that when they were a child, the sun used to enter from that particular angle when they were reading or something, and you could not interview them on that basis. It had to be sort of an indirect listening. And I think that because I've also seen you in these practices of listening and improving, our ability to listen to each other, might bring about the possibility of having these technodiversities flourish. And just because of the diversity, not because it's good or bad, because otherwise we're back into this dualism, but because it introduces this diversity, which all of a sudden starts to fight internally this what did you call it? reality. Yes. So I don't know if this question makes any sense, but
very much so. It's
okay.
a powerful question. Thank you, Madeleine.
And you said my name really well. Thank you.
Of course. Yes, I'm
See,
to.
here's the cultural difference. Madalena, you said it.
But this is a tricky one, right? Here's off the cuff how I think about this. Under the frame of humanism, the frame under which we've lived since the Enlightenment, which culminates today, it is a universality that purports the it's both a universality in and of itself, but it also purports that every human is a universe unto itself. That universal human rights, that the individual is the highest tenet, the equality among individuals, etc., etc. I would argue that contemporary discourses over diversity of points of view are a humanist angle, therefore humanist, therefore perhaps hegemonic, therefore perhaps Western. Only a Westerner can speak about diversity. It is a hegemonic angle on something that from another angle might be seen or has been called multipolarism. And when we say, instead of diversity, when we say multipolarism, it gets tricky, because diversity can only prevent ending up in conflict if there is an overarching humanist sphere around it that prevents that conflict. That basically, in my view, is maintained by aircraft carriers, dollars, and Coca-Cola and oil. Because if you remove that from the equation, diversity of perspectives ends up in war. That's the goal of Dugan. That's the goal of anti-Western points of view. Now, do I take a side? Not really. But I mean, obviously on the Western one, but like theoretically, I'm just trying to like posit both of these perspectives. So there is obviously, and here I'm going to be a Machiavellian pragmatist. Insofar as it is useful for a specific project, for a specific brief, and a specific client to bring in alternative, perspectives and to make it reach, utilize, which is a very dark word, the perspective of other people for the purposes of the project, then, from the pragmatic design ethical point of view, then you should do it because it's going to help the design be effective. If it doesn't, then pragmatically speaking, from the Machiavellian perspective, you are being moral but unethical. Meaning, you're saying yes to something, even though yes to something morally, but you are being unethical as a designer. That's for me leads me to the question between morals and ethics. So the way that I define and separate radically both is that morality is something designable that has to do with the perception that any given group or individual has of the values in their world, faithfulness to discourse, whereas ethics is faithfulness to one's own desire. So for a designer to be an ethical designer means my designs are well made. An ethical doctor is a doctor that will operate on the person and the results will be achieved no matter what. But then what this means is that we can have, this is very Zizek, we can have a couple of scenarios. You can be ethical but immoral. An ethical designer in the Nazi regime, for example, or in the Stalinist regime, might have said things and spoken truth to power in a way that, to be an ethical designer, they had to be immoral. They had to contest the power at hand. And you could also invert that and say that you can also be moral but unethical. You can replace effectiveness as a designer so as to just say yes to whatever is you're supposed to say in every given moment in time. Like people in the Soviet regime who would not tell Stalin that he was sick. They were being moral, but they were being unethical. And then Stalin died, if you all know the story. He died because no doctor would even dare to say, secretary, you are sick, you're going to die. Nobody dared because secretary is God. So they were being unethical but moral. I think that is the same thing that applies to this question of diverse perspectives. Diverse perspectives is a moral thing under the humanist moralist regime. But because I'm trying to understand how to design moral regimes themselves, I have to be able to understand that outside of this humanist moral regime, we could conceive, and this is what Dugin wants, and he knows what he wants. We could also conceive that these multiple perspectives will lead to conflict if there is not any overarching perspective on top of it, which is usually white and Western, which is this like colonialist perspective by 3 or 4 degrees of separation. It's what Zizek says about, I buy chocolate that comes from a factory from children in Central America who are farming it. Oh, but I pay a little bit more money so I can be okay with it and it's fine. So
I wasn't really going there. I mean, it was more from the perspective of AI because AI will tell us the truth. I mean, it mirrors us. Okay, but the training sets. Okay, like there's this recent book by this woman Wendy Kyung-chung that came out just recently from MIT called Discriminating Data, and she found that many of the early sociological data that was gathered for training sets that is still there was based on studies, the earliest studies, which was like the 20s, okay, on segregated housing, for example. And of course, the way the data was collected, because there was a bias, it gave the training sets a default setting, okay, which is still there these original training sets are based on eugenic principles, which
Yeah.
are looking for continuity between past, present, and future, looking for the invariables and make them reproduce. So I guess I'm more thinking about how people like yourself, who are very, very conscious of this sort of, you could say, master-slave dialectic between the machine and us, you know, both ways. Whether criteria for the training sets would be something that would enter your ontological design as a major priority.
So I work in conversational AI, and one of the things that is usually becomes glaring to me day in and day out is how at the end of the day, it's a bunch of if statements, and someone selecting them. That someone, like you say correctly, is obviously going to, even unconsciously, put in their own personal biases onto the selection of the data sets, and therefore, influence and bias where it goes. What is the answer to that? What is the answer to that in terms of ontological design? That's I guess what I'm going to try to answer. Depends on the brief and depends on the goal. The universal humanist goal would be humanist, and I want to really stress this word. The universal humanist goal would be, let us, based on a clear definition of the challenge, include the best possible data set in order to complete that challenge. That would be the ethical design thing to do. Get from A to B. If you get to B, good. The data set has achieved something. So it always has this repercussion, this connection to the end goal, to what the design is intending to do. But there's also the
Sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
Why is that? You know, because for example, I mean, this is again, consider me a lay person, but just obviously an aspiring elder. So I try. You know, for example, Dave Snowden, he talks about micro narratives.
Yeah.
He's sending out 16-year-olds because they tell the truth about their parents, about their neighbors, about whatever's going on. And these micro narratives start to introduce a nuance, you know, that especially when you just said that you speak on conversational AI, it would seem like that would start to introduce the requisite variety. And I think we need ontological designers, such as yourself, to actually be generalists, you know. And I mean, I think that the human question, when we're talking about the interface between this networked mycelial sort of structure, like you said in the beginning, that we've never, ever before, we're in a co-evolutionary leap moment, right? That it seems like where it starts is in the gathering of the elements that go into the training sets before we even make anything.
It does. I get you, but maybe the question that I would ask you in return is, for what project? And this is a deep question, meaning like, what is the project that we're trying to solve for? Answering this question is important because, like, let me put the question in another way. TikTok has invaded the United States and has invaded the whole of the West, and its effects have been incredible and super fast. It is bad for the West in many ways, but if you are a political leader of China, you're pretty happy with it. So for them, it's a good thing. For us, it's a bad thing. So that's the dichotomy that I need to always keep in mind, because when we say,
no, but I totally agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly getting out of the good and bad and become, as you said, if these are uncharted waters, and that's your ancestors, if these are uncharted waters, then, you know, navegavam sem o mapa que faziam, you know,
Destrolávio.
Yes, no, but they navigate it without the map that they made. The poet's
Yeah.
female Reiner described
Wow.
our sailing that way. Okay, so it seems to me that you know, at the same time as the map is not the territory. Okay, let's just go with that. Then, what in your experience already, and in the experience as you go along, how can this, for lack of a better term, I'm going to use Nora Bateson's warm data. How can warm data enter into, not because it's good or bad, it's just because it's there. Why should we ignore it?
Right.
And flatten flatten this requisite variety for this.
Okay. I think I get you. Forgive me if I'm going to give an answer that is a slight dodge, but I think it's the correct answer, which is what I would do to answer that is I would gather a team of a variety of people and I would study it, who am I going to bring in, etc., and give them a challenge. The challenge is, let's discuss the parameters that we think are the correct ones to analyze to feed into this algorithm, because it's as important to discuss the parameters as it is to define the actual project. And sometimes it is industry secret, so important these parameters are. Cambridge Analytica used psychography. That's already old news. Perhaps in the future there will be others, but it's really important to sort of figure out what are the parameters that you choose from. What is the data you bring into the conversation? That's a discovery phase unto itself, but that's essential. That's actually very such a nice question, because those are the basic terms that you're going to measure for in the early stages of the project. Because once you measure for those, then you have a ground, then you have a subject matter on which to design. It's like bringing a bunch of psychoanalysts, watching the people on a house in the Big Brother style. What's the data that we really want to look out for?
Can I ask you?
Yeah, exactly. Carl, would you go on with your question?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your work and for being a good friend in this area. I just wanted to make some points and then sort of put a question out to you. But this idea of reality designing, I think, is about becoming a live player, right? It's we're literally using these techniques, as you mentioned. I'm looking at context engineering, which is very much about practice. I think the theories that you're putting together, Daniel, and the practices of context engineering, which is when we're maybe using a prosthetic, and it could be a technology or an analog prosthetic that enables you to change a sense. So, for instance, vision. I've worn a 360 helmet for a week, which gave me 360 vision. So, hacking sense, a vision. I mean, that's simply one sense. You can do the same with sound, where you can transform your sound environment just by eliminating certain sounds out of the environment. And taste as well. You're able to transform your taste using things like the aroma fork, which is a nice bit of technology. But it's very much about then creating new senses. And I think what's interesting is that we can do these experiments on ourselves, and that's like creating tulpas, right? You're creating this other, a personal other, like tulpa is this thought form. And the practice of that is already occult enough in some ways, Daniel. And I've actually hosted a talk on how to create a tulpa, and then another friend of mine was like, "You shouldn't release that because morally it's a handbook for either thriving or disaster within the same person." So what you said about this is not for everyone. Ontological design is not for everyone. It may not even be for me. What are the entry requirements? I mean, we talk about the ancient mystery schools. It was always only for the few. So is ontological design or context engineering only for the minority? And are they self-selecting just because they've reached that level of doing context engineering? but they've got demonstrable experience. Just like when I go into a clinical trial at Imperial, they want to see at least 2 breakthroughs. So I show experience of context engineering as an aptitude, and then that gets me in. I mean, I think your handbook, the one that I'm writing, are these things for everyone, or will it just be a self-selecting group? And codes of conduct, we know in the occult that you mentioned, you're mirroring serious codes of conduct, not just in terms of initiation, so you're only able to talk within your own group, and we're trying to democratize these practices, but to what end? Because as we know, every technology creates its own negativity. So our academies therefore will create such negativities and dark renaissance.
It's interesting, right? Because these are conversations that we are beyond mercenary theory, which is feasible in the industry type level, which is, there's handbooks for this. You don't need to be an inspired Leonardo da Vinci to design a website. That's the mercenary theory level, what I call it. But the other level that you discussed, Carl, I feel like it hinges on the establishment of a conversation with your own unconscious. And here you cannot make any rules yourself that will not in turn risk being broken, and that will not humble us in return. In other words, like, I feel like, yes, it is the self-selected who will perhaps, hopefully in the future, maybe not me, obviously not me, come up with the reality tunnels that will house large swaths of the next civilization under them, the great prophets and artists of the future. And yes, it will be the self-selected ones, but they will be self-selected precisely because they are in touch with their own negativity in a way that few people are. There's a level of conversation with nothingness there. The fact that we're going to die and that the cosmos is ultimately meaningless, and I could try to characterize this as best as I can, but it's probably going to be hard. But there's an ultimate horror in there. And Cadell's actually here. He's done a brilliant thesis on the phenomenology of spirit by Hegel, of how knowledge needs to emerge in relationship with this, in tarrying with this negativity. Substance as subject, knowledge as subject. We cannot separate ourselves, if we're going to be hopefully the great creative ontological designers, from the equation at a deep level. And so that's my answer to you, is that self-selection happens in the conversation that you have with your own ghosts. And then, we are humans. Whenever we see a good artist, whenever we see a good performance of a truthful thing, we cannot help but to look. That's why we like not classical, but that's why some artists throughout history have been like tremendous. And if I ask you what was number 2 on the Billboard last week, you don't remember, because it's just from the factory. It's mercenary theory. However, there are classics. There are things that go into the canon because they somehow signal this conversation that has happened between the unconscious of the artist and the artist. That is so truthful that even we can mirror ourselves in it, right? Exactly. We must learn to approach, we must learn anew how to approach ourselves in the world as the unknown. Reconsider the distinction between the calculable and what is incalculable. And that's the relationship that's a shamanic practice that cannot be taught by anyone other than by ourselves and by our unconscious. And this is why you're correct, Har. Like, I need to divide this into 2 things, the esoteric and the exoteric, because outside I can go tomorrow and sell this easy. It's a mercenary theory type thing. But on the inside, if I'm not risking anything, I'm not creating. But those who risk, then yes, they might be creating something. And those, the future that will be created by these. In other words, Elon Musk, you need to get fuel and food to Mars, but you better make sure to get some smart priests. Otherwise, the people there will just eat each other up. Or some good communication channels so that the moralities from here can get there, if you know what I mean. Because the self-sustaining of human morality in a void is not an easy feat. That's one of the great achievements of morality. That's why we don't break down into the barbarism every single day. Because somehow we've managed to create this story, this house, and that's, it's not the perfect house, but it's good enough to keep us going. and not descend into mimetic rivalry and eat each other up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to come back on it, I think that what I'm trying to get at is that, you know, a lot of us are creating tulpas in a personal practice, but when we create an academy, we create egregores. You know, we create egregores, and I think the responsibility at that point is much larger, because you're creating, through that practice, you're creating altered traits rather than just altered states.
Absolutely. I think it's like, yes, you can create egregores and tulpas at scale because you want to and because someone paid you to do it. You kind of can do it with a level of success, but it's not as easy as we might think. The level of success we might achieve just by de facto mandate by someone who pays you a lot of money, like McDonald's, to create a McDonald's tulpa around the world, you can achieve some success. But for that tulpa, for those egregores to reach that level of success that is actually civilizationally founding, it's not as easy as that. It is incredibly hard, I would even say.
All right, guys. Daniel, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Tom.
Yes.
For the space.
Yes, that was very interesting. I hope we can continue at another time.
Sounds
thank
brilliant.
you all for coming and participating. I will hope you check out his book, Ontological Design. It's fantastic.
Support Ontological Design.
Thank you, Goodell.
Go get the book. Out now. Daniel Fragga.
What?
It's Mr. Last is revealing himself from behind his beautiful picture. Yeah, thank you so much, Tom, for the invite and for the space, and thank you everybody for coming, for the lovely conversation. Yeah, let's do this again. Let's all keep in touch. Sounds beautiful.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.